are listening to Inside Voices on WNHHLP 103.5 FM.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, or afternoon. I hope that everybody is staying safe inside in some AC right now because it is a hot, hot day. And again, my hope for everyone is that we find really good shelter and that we keep children and the elderly and our pets and all of those folks inside and safe. Welcome to Inside Voices. My name is Georgia Goldberg, and I am the director of Hope for New Haven as well as the co-founder of Circle. We were supposed to have Melissa Griffith today from the Office of Early Childhood to talk about this wonderful initiative that's being shepherded into many communities across the state by the Office of Early Childhood. And I'm just gonna, for brevity, just refer to the agency as OEC. Most people are going to refer to that agency as OEC. And unfortunately, Melissa could not be with us today. So I felt like this was a great opportunity to talk about what happened in the legislative session this year in Connecticut's legislative session. Of course, there's some things happening at the federal level. We know about Donald Trump's big, beautiful bill, and that will certainly have impact and repercussion on parents with children that are between the ages of 0 through definitely age 7. And those repercussions are certainly going to be felt in Connecticut. But Connecticut did something extraordinary this legislative session by passing historic legislation. And it is historic in that Connecticut has made a step forward to say we are going to take ownership in some parts, a much more larger role in how childcare is funded in Connecticut. And what I want to do in this show is just to kind of dispel um, well, not so much dispel, but basically talk about what's in the legislation and what's not in the legislation. And I guess I use the word dispel only because there has been lots of reporting on what happened in the legislative session. And one of the things that I hear referenced a lot is universal preschool and universal childcare. And part of this conversation is not so much to dispel, but to explain a little bit more what Connecticut actually did so that if people are expecting that in about a year or two, every single parent in Connecticut will have access to free childcare. That's not what happened in the legislation. What happened in the legislation is that Connecticut is laying a foundation for families that earn $100,000 or less to have access to free childcare. But if parents are expecting or the community are expecting to see every single child in households with $100,000 or less having access to free childcare, that's not what's going to happen. So that's some of the things that I want to make sure that we are understanding today, but not minimizing what Connecticut has done. So let's start with the two pieces of legislation that passed. There is actually another component of legislation that did pass, and that's going to have more indirect, more so than direct impact on Connecticut families. And that is the Connecticut bond, the finance and bond bill that also came out of this legislative session. And I'm going to talk about that towards the end. But the two primary legislation I'm going to speak to is HB 5003 and SB 1. SB 1 is actually the most, well, not the most important in that it has the meat and potatoes of what is going to transform Connecticut's system. So SB 1, Senate Bill 1, and the relevance of that bill being number one, people should know that's an indication of how important this this piece of legislation was. The House and the Senate named their bill, And usually in a legislative session, depending on where you fall in terms of number, that indicates the priority that a piece of legislation have either to the Senate or to the House. Definitely the governor came out with his proposal, and his proposal is wrapped into these two pieces of legislation. So SB 1 basically creates an endowment fund, and an endowment fund is actually the governor's idea. So when the governor came out with his proposal, what the governor wanted to do was to create an endowment fund. And if you think about it in the most simplistic term, it's really a savings and investment account. And what the governor wanted to recognize in Connecticut is that um, there isn't something like in, I think it's in New Mexico. New Mexico um, basically allocated certain funding from natural gas that they produce in the state to fund childcare. And we have looked at different ways in Connecticut to figure out how to fund childcare, how to identify a reliable funding stream for childcare. And Connecticut didn't really have anything that could necessarily do that. And so the governor, as commissioner by Share, just called her up and say, hey, what if we were to do an endowment fund? And the benefit of an endowment fund is that you can put it in an account, and that account can, grow from interest. It can grow from investments. You can get donations for that fund. And the most important thing is that this fund doesn't count under the spending cap. And I'm not going to go into the legalese of the spending cap, the volatility cap, and all of those things because it's not really germane to our conversation today. But what's important is that the money that goes into this endowment, um, and again, this is not necessarily secured funds. I'm going to explain how the fund is funded, but that money that goes into the endowment is just really there specifically for early care and education. So it doesn't go, it's not a part of the state budget. It cannot be moved into other line item. It is specific to childcare. And again, people can um, make donations. This fund can be invested. And what the plan is to fund this on an ongoing basis is that Connecticut will take whatever the remaining surplus is after the state of Connecticut has met all of its obligation. Whatever that remaining surplus is going to be, that is going to be swept into this endowment fund. Um, and there was no endpoint to this in this legislative session. Of course, future legislative session can put a sunset date on, first and foremost, when Connecticut is going to stop funding this with surplus dollars, or put a cap on how much money this endowment fund is going to have. So right now, the way that the endowment works is at the end of every legislative session, after Connecticut has met its obligation, any surplus that's left over will be shifted in this endowment fund. And this endowment fund will basically be the piggy bank in which Connecticut will pull down money to fund its early care system. So that's the first thing. And only 12%, and we've discussed this with the commissioner in previous shows, so we're not going to go into those details as well. But 12% to 10% is going to be used each year to fund childcare. So the most important piece of this legislation or part of the system that Connecticut is going to fund is early start. And people are going to hear going forward about early start. This is just my prediction. This is not anything that I know to be a fact, but again, based on how they set up the endowment fund and based on how they're planning to use the endowment fund, what we will see is that Connecticut will shift from all the disparate ways that parents have paid for childcare to one or two major ways of paying for childcare, and that's either out of pocket or through early start. So everybody should get to know the term early start CT, because that is going to be the major funding source to support parents around, or the hope is for that to be the major funding source to help parents cover childcare, and will be the mechanism through which we can deliver universal, and I'm putting it in air quotes, and I'm going to explain a little bit more, universal childcare to families. And it is through this grant fund or through this endowment fund that parents who have access to these funds will not have to pay any childcare cost if your income or household income is below 100,000. If you are above 100,000 or more, if you have access to these funds, you will only have to pay 7% of your household income towards childcare. And note my language, I'm saying if you have access to this fund, because again, this is a fund that you parents are going to have to find the centers that have access to these funds or will be able to plug into these funds, because not every single childcare center in Connecticut will have these funds. And so if you are a parent and you in 2027 or 2028, whichever year you're looking to find childcare, when the state of Connecticut comes out and announce, we now have universal childcare through Early Start. A part of that conversation that they will have, and I hope that they're going to have in a very um, meaningful way, is that only certain centers will have access to these grant funds. And so that when you select a particular center that has access to these grant funds, you will then you will get the benefit of these grant funds. If you select a center that doesn't have access to these grant funds, then you are going to be paying childcare costs the way that you would normally pay childcare costs. So let me explain for those folks who don't have children and who are not interacting with the early care system. If you are a parent and you have a child between 0 through the age of 5, and we're just for this argument, we're going to talk about children 0 through age 5. Certainly, this fund will impact children beyond age 5, but for this conversation, let's talk about children 0 to 5. If you are a parent with a child 0 to 5, you are going to rely on your network to try to find a childcare center. And usually I run a childcare center, Hope Child Development Center, 81 Olive Street. If parents are interested in spaces for newborn or infants, we do have some spaces available. So that's just a shout out for my agency. But if you were looking for childcare, you would do a couple of things. You would call up, just do some cold calling to find out where childcare centers are. And if it's close to you, you would reach out to that center to try to find if there's any availability and what price it will be. Or you can go to 211 Childcare if you're familiar with that site, and they will certainly give you access to childcare centers in your neighborhood or around your home if that's where you're interested in childcare. Most parents are looking for childcare that's close to their work. So you can go to 211 and find out. You can also call 211 and they will give you a list of childcare centers that are around your area to assist you. But you're really cold calling. You're Googling, which is what a lot of our parents tell us. They found us on Google, or they will get a referral from a family friend, and then they will call up and say, "Hey, I'm looking for childcare. Do you have availability? What is the cost?" Right? And that's where we start to talk to parents about what it is that they're eligible for. Our program is an early start program. So if a parent comes to our program and they say, well, what is the cost? Now, my childcare, we charge $400 a week at Hope for childcare, but no parent in my center pays $400 a week. Right, that's our rate, but no parent pays that because we have early start. So a parent will have to bring in their birth certificate, and they'll have to bring in either their tax return or their last, two pay stubs or their pay stub for the last month. And then we will determine based on early start criteria how much a parent is supposed to pay out of pocket. Most people will see that as a sliding scale. And so for our families, depending on your income, you will either pay a maximum of $300 or you could pay zero, especially if you have care for kids. Now, So when our families come to us, we tell them, well, we can't tell you the rate because we have early start, and that determines the rate. Prior to us being an early start center, we relied, a lot of parents either paid out of pocket that $400 or they are subsidized by the Care for Kids program. Now, Care for Kids is a program that is funded both by the federal government and by the state. And there are lots, and the basic criteria for Care for Kids is if your state median income, your household state median income is below 60%, I think it's 60% now for new applicants, then you're eligible for the Care for Kids program. And what Care for Kids would do would ask you for some income information, and they would go through about a 30 to 45 day processing, and they will issue you a certificate. The certificate will come back and say, of the $400 that Circle pays, you will only be responsible for $50. There was a change in the federal law that said that the Care for Kids certificate must ensure that parents pay 7% or less of their income. So Care for Kids will cover the 93%, and parents will cover 7% of the Care for Kids basic rate, right? So a parent, after they've been issued a certificate, will come and say, my family fee is $20 or $40 or $50. That's what they pay us, and Care for Kids will pay the rest. There's more nuance to it, but just high level, that's pretty much how it works. And you also have other types of funds called prior to early start, the child daycare contract, which is the contract that we had before it became early start. And you also have school readiness. A lot of people may hear about school readiness, and school readiness really is a program that serves 3 and 4-year-olds across certain communities. School readiness was not in every community. And of course, parents pay out of pocket, and we don't have to belabor the fact that, it's really very expensive. Childcare is really very expensive, and a lot of parents do not have resources to help them to pay. So for many years, advocates like myself have been lobbying both federally and statewide to say we need to do something to fix childcare for many families because that has been a determining factor in whether women, more specifically women, or even men can afford to go into the workforce. And most of our pleas have fallen on deaf ears until the pandemic. And when the pandemic hit, people realize, listen, businesses realize we cannot function in the state and across the country if parents do not have access to childcare. And if cost is a barrier, we need to act to make sure that we remove that barrier. And that's what Connecticut did. So Connecticut basically, with this endowments fund, is saying we have all of these different ways that we're funding childcare. And with all of the different ways that we fund childcare, there's also different types of reporting, certain rules that apply to different programs. And so programs may have access to 4 different funding sources. Head Start, which is also another big way that childcare is funded in the state, but that's not by Connecticut. That's through the federal government. So a program may have Head Start funds, they may have school readiness funds, they may have Care for Kids, and then they may have CDC. And all of these 4 programs are supporting parents in different ways, but that requires all of these reporting rules. So Connecticut says, listen, let's just create one fund. That's the early start. So there will be no more CDC or child daycare contract, no more um, school readiness, and early start wraparound, which is not necessarily tied to the federal government, but funding that's been used to support and give additional care to families who are receiving Care for Kids. We are going to wrap that into one fund, Early Start. And those funds are given to centers through a contract, and you have to respond to a request for proposal to receive these funds. Right now, I think it's about maybe 25 to about 30% of programs in Connecticut that are receiving these funds. Don't quote me, but it's just to kind of show you that 80% of, or close to 80% now, because I do know Connecticut made some of these funding available. Um, over the past couple of months. And so the numbers may be a little bit different from when I last got actual data on it. But there's about 80, let's say, 70% of programs that do not have access to these funds. What this endowment fund is hoping to do is to raise the number of programs that are contracted under Early Start. And that's going to be important because if the governor comes out and legislators come out and say, hey, parents, there is now universal childcare and you can now go and your childcare will be free. Well, that's not quite true because you have to go and find a program that has early start and then you will benefit from those grant funding. But if you cannot find a program that has the early start grant funding, you are not going to be a beneficiary of this. So what I am thinking that they're hoping to do, OEC is hoping to do, is in the next 2 years to put out and to build up the capacity in the system so that we can have at least 50%. Hopefully, this is my number. I'm hoping that at least 50% of programs will have access to the Early Start grant so that more parents will benefit from this. So, what it's important for folks to know is why this is historic is because we've never had in Connecticut a fund that's just dedicated to assist parents with childcare. And we've never had a fund that covers the full cost of care for parents making under $100,000. That's extraordinary. Care for Kids does not do that, right? Care for Kids covers families that are 60% of the state median income and below. So that leaves a lot of families in the middle without any type of assistance. So you have parents that are at the lower end of the income threshold. They have access to childcare subsidy, and parents, and I know for many parents, childcare is still one of the largest part of their household budget, but you do have parents who are making enough in Connecticut that they can afford to pay $400 a week. And it's tight, but there are parents who can. It's the parents that are in between that 60 to 100% of state median income that really struggle. And they're going to be the ones that are going to be mostly impacted by early start. So again, extraordinary historic legislation. We've never had a designated fund in Connecticut to pay for childcare, and parents have never had access to a fund where they can go in and 100% of their costs will be covered if you are below $100,000 in state median income. Not even Care for Kids did that. Majority of the parents in the Care for Kids program had a fee. So this is an extraordinary thing that Connecticut did. And that's an extraordinary thing that SB1 did. But it's not universal because unless every single center has access to these funds, when parents go in, they're going to have to pay out of pocket because the grant funds will not be there to cover their out-of-pocket fee. And you have some programs who may not opt into Early Start because Early Start does have some requirements. And one of the big requirements that Early Start has, and this was something that was also addressed in the bill, and I'm trying to think, I'm forgetting if it was SB1 or HB 5003, if it was a House bill where it was addressed. I think it was a House bill, but either one of the bills basically talked about what was driving the cost of care for many families, and that is the fact that it is very labor intensive. This work is labor intensive. It requires a lot of bodies to operate a childcare center. And because it's labor intensive and because the tension between what parents can pay and what the actual cost of care is so great, what ended up happening is that many teachers in the early care system do not make anything most above minimum wage. Most teachers are making at or close to minimum wage in early care and education. And Early Start and Head Start and some of these other funds require teachers to go to school and get a bachelor's degree or an associate degree. And what happens is when a teacher gets a bachelor's degree, her tuition, her income doesn't go up. And I'm saying her because the majority of teachers in the system are women. So you are working, going to school, earning your bachelor's degree, making $18 an hour. You can earn your bachelor's degree, you may get $18.25 or 50 cents an hour more because you've earned your bachelor's degree. And for many teachers, that's not anything that is sustainable to them because they're also incurring student loan debt to get a bachelor's degree. So then they leave. So the industry cannot attract people or keep people because the wage is so low. So this legislation, Early Start, basically says that if you go to school, if you get these funds, if you as a childcare center accept these funds, not only are you going to reduce parents' tuition in this manner, but you're also going to have to pay your teachers according to the wages that OEC has set, the OEC compensation wage scale. And that wage scale is looking at making sure that there's parity across the board for early care teachers with K-12 teachers. And we know K-12 teachers do not get paid a lot, but they definitely get paid significantly more than early child educators. And so we created a compensation scale, wage scale that um, sets the beginning or entry point or the entry that the entry salary for anyone who has certain educational attainment. So if you have a high school diploma, if you have an associate degree, bachelor's degree, CDA, master's degree and above, the wage scale sets the compensation level at a certain amount. And if you take these funds, you are going to have to pay teachers at a certain level. So that's one of the things that it came out of the legislation and that the legislation will require in the next 2 years so that teachers now who are working in the system can make a livable wage or even more than a livable wage. The other thing that came out of the legislation is health insurance, looking at creating a health insurance pool for the industry because again, um, the industry is very fragile financially, and most providers cannot, or centers and programs can do not or cannot offer health insurance. And that is one of the things that advocates spoke about in their in different types of listening sessions with the governor and with the commissioner and with legislators. And they felt like making sure that there is a pool, that we can create a pool or not a pool, I'm sorry, create a subsidy program to offset childcare costs. And I'm sorry if you're hearing noise. I don't know what's going on outside, but they're going to create a subsidy program to help providers or educators in the early care system to lower their health insurance costs or even just get health insurance. So that's a couple of things that came out of the legislation. Now, this is something that will be available to all employees in the early care system. So regardless of if you're a part of Early Start, regardless of if you take care for kids, as long as you are in a program, a licensed child care program in the state of Connecticut, and you're an employee in one of these licensed child care facility, you will have access to this subsidy. So if your employer doesn't offer health insurance and you get health insurance through Access Health, if you have an out-of-pocket cost, then this exchange, the health exchange, will help to reduce that out-of-pocket cost. Nothing has been said, so I can't say by how much or how much will be put towards a health insurance premium to help providers to pay. But again, that's an extraordinary thing to come out of this because um, for many individuals in the early care system, those are reasons why they leave the industry and why classrooms are shuttered across the state since the pandemic. And some classrooms still have not really come back to its full operational capacity. So that is a piece of legislation that will certainly help the industry. And the goal in this legislative session was to try to do two things, to address the issue of cost for parents, as well as to address the the labor shortage in early care and education. And the way to do that is to ensure that they are raising wages and to ensure that people have access to insurance, or have coverage or support around their insurance so that the industry will be attractive to them. So that's what SB1 did. Um, SB through SB 5003 did something else for parents that I think will be interesting. And anyone who knows, and I've shared at the top of the conversation that many parents rely on word of mouth or Google or 211 or, all of these different ways to find out what programs are available to them. I'm sorry, HB 5003 will set up a pilot program in about, I think, about three hospitals, or and again, if I'm misquoting the numbers, but it's a small number of hospitals. They're going to pilot a program that is going to connect parents who are coming in to give birth with childcare information and resources. And when I shared this with my parents during our parent advisory council meeting, one of my parents said that that would have been so helpful for her if she had known at the time when she was in the hospital getting ready to give birth, if she had had access to some resources to help her to think about childcare and how to access resources. That would have been a huge help to her. And we know that this is a big help, for families because most families are going to the hospital and that's where they're spending a lot of their time as they're getting ready to have their baby. And we know that there are missed opportunities when parents come to, their obstetrician or, their local hospital to find out about what's available to them outside of the hospital system. We want to be a state that is more proactive than a reactive state. We want to support parents in advance of incidents and issues rather than after. And so this is a part of what the state wants to do is to make sure that when parents through this pilot program to kind of see how effective and impactful it will be if hospitals are connecting parents with resources, early care resources, childcare resources at that point of entry. So that's something that came out of the this legislative session. And, again, with every pilot, we hope to learn things and to see what works and what doesn't work. But the hope is to make sure that this is something that is a resource that's available in all hospital systems across Connecticut because we want to have a prenatal to five care system, right? We know, especially for Black mothers, that, we are particularly vulnerable in the medical system when it comes to childbirth. And I think, not just, connecting families to childcare information, but also helping our families to understand what's available to them to have, good and healthy births. And if we have issues, or if they are detecting issues with their babies, that they know that their systems like Birth to Three and nurturing families that are out there to help families. And so this is what this legislation will seek to do through this pilot. And again, we hope for it to grow in the state. So that is some of the things that came out that are wonderful things. The other wonderful thing I mean, it's all great stuff. I think it's all great stuff, but there's some gaps in this legislative session. And again, we weren't trying to solve all problems this legislative session, but there are some gaps that I'm going to talk about later. But one of the other big thing that came out of this legislative session is the creation of a parent portal so that parents are no longer left to, their own devices to kind of figure out what where to find resources for their families. If you are a parent, you have a child, you're getting ready to put that baby in childcare, you will have access to a parent portal where you can go in, register your child there in that particular portal. You can also, through that portal, gain access to Care for Kids or find out where early start programs are going to be. You're going to be able to see where the availabilities are. I can tell you, I've spoken to so many parents who have called me just, after despair of, cold calling to find out about childcare spaces. And I'll never forget one parent, she was pregnant and, they're coming in and they're doing a tour. And she had visited so many centers and she was exhausted. I mean, I think she was like maybe 6 or 7 months pregnant, and she was exhausted from going and hearing there is not a space. You're going to have to go on a waiting list. And I remember she just sat down and she started to cry when I told her, she's going to have to go on a waiting list for us because, we couldn't guarantee a space. And she got me. I have to be honest. She broke me, and I was like, okay, we'll work to make sure that we get you into the program, and we did. But I can't tell you how many parents that are coming and this is their first baby and they just are tired from cold calling centers and going to centers and hearing about waiting lists and feeling like the stress of not knowing where their baby's going to be, after they have to go back to work. And since that parent Connecticut has put some really great things in place for families, so parents don't feel the need to have to go back to work right away. We have the paid family leave that give parents a lot more time to stay at home, and it also gives them more time to find spaces as well. But the critical thing we have to do in Connecticut is to create more spaces for families, and that's something that this legislation also helps to do. So again, having a portal where a parent can just go in, enroll, start to, go through that portal to find childcare instead of calling all of these different places. Everything will be there, I hope. And I'm saying I hope because, with technology, not everything, technology doesn't always answer all of our questions, right? But a parent can definitely go to that one-stop shop and find out where early start programs are, where Head Start programs are, where programs are that have availability, what the waiting list situation will be, and they can select programs as well that are accredited, that have, certain specialized programs. If you work with children that are autistic, you'll get to see that there. If you work with children that have speech delay or that have, come from families that speak a different language, all of those things will be listed there. They're listed now in 211 Childcare. Parents can go to 211childcare.org and they can find childcare programs that list that. But the difference with 211childcare.org, it doesn't pull all of the different pieces of the system together and just connect parents in one place. This portal will do that, and that is a beautiful, wonderful thing. Now, the bad news. Now, we've talked about the good news. A part of the bad news, again, I've shared is early start is not going to be available to every parent in every center in today or even in 2028 when it's scheduled to be launched wholesale. So not all parents will benefit from having childcare that will be free or will only be 7% of their state of their, I'm sorry, their family income. But the hope and the goal is that this is something that we are going to build capacity in the system so that it can truly be universal. And the way to do that is to keep the state's commitment to sweep surpluses into this endowment fund. So that's also the other bad news, that this fund is only funded if there are surpluses. And if the state agrees to fund the endowment fund with surplus. Connecticut has a lot of needs, and whatever's going to pass out of the federal government is definitely going to impact other types of programs in the state. And I don't know what the appetite will be for the states to continue just to fund the early care system with the surpluses that are if we continue to have surpluses. I don't know what the appetite is going to be for other constituents to say, yeah, let all of the surpluses go to early care and education. So that is one of the big danger. Will we continue to have access to those surpluses? The other big danger is, will Connecticut continue to have these massive surpluses that it's been generating each year? So if we don't have surpluses, we don't get funded. So that is one of the big danger. Now, the other major danger, well, bad news, I should say, that came out of the legislative session, or not so great news, is Care for Kids. And that one I am most concerned about because the Care for Kids program is what widely supports most of the children that are whose families are below state need 60% state median income. So that is their lifeline. And right now that program is effectively closed. So every family that applies for Care for Kids as of January 1, they're being placed on a waiting list. And so if you are a parent making $30,000 a year and you need Care for Kids to go to work and to pay for your child care, Care for Kids is not available to you right now. And it hasn't been available to you since January, at the beginning of the year, January. And so for many families, and we're already seeing it, many families are keeping those low income vulnerable families are keeping their children home with grandparents, or they're just not going into the workforce because they cannot afford care. If you're making $30,000 a year, you certainly cannot afford to pay Hope Child Development Center $400. And again, you wouldn't pay Hope $400 because we are early start, but prior to us being early start, you would not be able to afford our center. And we're basically seeing that right now in our program. The parents who are coming in are the parents who have the resources right now to pay for childcare. And not at my center necessarily, but across the board. We are seeing parents who are just low income parents that are just waiting to hear from Care for Kids. And we are hearing that Care for Kids may not really be able to meet the capacity of the demand before September. And there was not enough funding that was secured for the Care for Kids program. And certainly we heard legislators share that, well, does it make sense to take like huge chunks of money to put in an endowment fund when there is an immediate need right now? And if I'm to put on my strategic hat, I think creating the endowment fund and put in funds in to kind of build up to like $1 billion that can generate, resources that doesn't necessarily rely even on surpluses from the state. That I think is a good, strategic move by the state. And I'm appreciative that, we are thinking, in a long-term strategic way, but also as an advocate on the ground that's serving families and providers who rely heavily on a program like Care for Kids. I'm torn because on one hand, I know that right now the system relies heavily on Care for Kids. And Care for Kids received $35 million in the budget, but that $35 million is just simply to raise the rate. And so parents right now who have Care for Kids, I'm saying to you, we say it to our parents, do not do anything to mess up your Care for Kids certificate. Because if you do not submit your paperwork in time, if you do not provide them with the information that they're requesting, if you get kicked off of Care for Kids, you are going to be going on a waiting list. And there are 6 going on 7 months of families that are ahead of folks. That's the bad news. And the good news, bad news is that $35 million will work to increase reimbursement rates for providers and for parents who are receiving the Care for Kids program. But the bad news is really that most parents are effectively locked out of this system, and this system is available, is widely available, whereas early start is not. So I think, and I don't want to mischaracterize, but I think the caseload of children or family, I think there's about 23,000 children that are being served through Care for Kids. If not, if it's not children, it's family. That's a lot of children and families that are being served. And but the need to serve the families on the waiting list far exceeds thirty five million dollars, right? So right now we are going to have to raise the alarm for many parents and engage parents in a conversation with legislators and with the governor around Care for Kids because this program is also federally funded. So if there are any federal cuts to this program, the situation is going to get really bad for families. Again, the really, really bad news is for those summer camp programs that's also rely on Care for Kids. Because what our hope was that in July 1, with a new fiscal year and a new state budget, that there will be new funds to bring parents off of the waiting list en masse, or even to support families that are getting ready to go into, well, summer camp has started. Many families are going to have like a shocker when they get a notice from Care for Kids saying, we received your application, we've reviewed your application, we're putting this on a waiting list, because then that means that parents are going to have to pay the full cost of summer camp care out of pocket. So those are some of the things that is in the legislative session. Again, it is a good thing for Connecticut, and I do not want to minimize the achievement that we had this year. I was, very disheartened a couple years ago when the governor put $0 in the budget for early care and education for the childcare system after COVID. And I have to say, I have been critical of policies that have come down, from the from legislators and from the governor's office and even from the Office of Early Child Education. But in this regard, I think this is a good thing. This is a good thing. It's going to have, you know, you're going to have some short-term pain for many families, and I do want to give name to that and give voice to that, especially families who rely heavily on the Care for Kids system. But why I think this is a better route for Connecticut is that we are not subjected to the ebbs and flow of the federal government in terms of our child care assistance, right? We have ownership of the early start funds. And when I say we, I mean advocates, parents, constituents. We have ownership of this fund. So we can always go and lobby our legislators to say this fund need more money or it needs to be spent in this way. Whereas at the federal level, you are just subjected to the whims of whoever is in Congress at that moment. And so Connecticut parents and businesses really need a reliable, dependable early care system. And children need a really well-funded early care system, and providers need that as well. And so to the extent that this does it, and we are going to be investing more in the early care system so that more families can be beneficiary of the Early Start Grant Fund. I think that this is a good thing. Um, Care for Kids, we're going to have to work as we always do, both at the federal level and at the state level to make sure that families are cared for in the Care for Kids system. And the last thing that I will mention in the last maybe 5 minutes is the bond funding. We were really very lucky to get about $80 million set aside in bond funding for early care facility. There is a huge dearth of infants and toddler spaces available for families. So it doesn't matter in Connecticut sometimes if you have $1 million or if you have $0. you're in the same boat in terms of finding spaces, right? There's not enough childcare facilities, and we need to build more childcare facilities. And there are childcare facilities as well that are in disrepair that needs to be modernized, that needs to be, renovated and upgraded. And we have set aside about $80 million so that childcare facilities can apply for and get these bond funds to renovate and upgrade and to build and expand on existing facilities or new facilities and bring like shuttered building back online by converting them to childcare facilities. And we will have about $80 million, I think, over the next 5 years in which to spend those bond funds to basically, again, add more childcare capacity in the system. And last conversation we had with Mission Driven Finances, we were talking about how we can use a real estate investment trust to add more family childcare businesses and provide avenues and pathways for people to own their own home and build wealth through their childcare business and through their home ownership. And so we are hopeful that all of these funds will be available to create multiple pathways to add capacity in the system because that's what's missing in Connecticut is capacity. So that is just like a quick overview of some of the things that were in SB1 and 5003. There's a lot more that are, I should say a lot more. Especially in SB1, there's a whole lot more in SB1 that impacts children. There is special education legislation in SB1. We certainly have legislation that is looking at how we support children that are not only having, special needs in early care and education, but also in a public school. So that's also in SB1. That is not my bailiwick, so I can't speak really in detail about what that piece of how that legislation impact families, but certainly Connecticut has made major investments in children this year, and it's not enough. And people are going to feel like, oh, but I thought we had like a whole lot of money that we were invested in children. Why am I not feeling this on the ground? We're not going to feel it right now because we're laying foundation for the future. And so some of this investments are not going to be felt by parents until 2027 and 2028. And we're hoping that in between those times that we can add even more resources and investments in the system for children and families because it's going to be dire out there for a lot of families, especially if the federal government follow through with some of the cuts that they are proposing. So what we are grateful for is that we have a state that at least is responsive to the advocacy needs of the providers and the parents and the business people. And, I've been thanking a lot of those business stakeholders because even though they're saying, oh no, you guys did it. I know for a fact that the governor was really very receptive to hearing from the business people saying that you need to address the early care system because we cannot operate. We cannot find people because childcare is reportedly the biggest barrier for them, for people to come into work. And when we do find people, the reason why families are calling out and people cannot come to work is because of childcare issue. So, this effort, I mean, I saw the commissioner and she was so excited, and so many of our advocates were excited. And, it was a bittersweet victory for me as well because I know the needs for providers right now. I know the needs for parents right now. But as an advocate, if we're thinking about, long term, what's the best path? I think having all the money that we have obviously would be the best path, but this is the best scenario that we could have for this legislative session and just recognizing that there's more work that needs to be done. And so my call to folks is to reach out and connect with Circle CT, Circle CT, CERCLE.org, and to see how they can get involved in advocacy. Circle is an organization that is interested in all children in Connecticut, but works primarily to support children in underserved communities, within vulnerable families, within vulnerable centers. So that is our mission. But when we advocate for all of Connecticut's children. One of the most underserved, you know, constituents are families of special needs children. Um, and no, there are lots of advocates for those families, but their voices aren't as loud when it comes within the early care system as it needs to be. And I don't think their voices are as loud across the system, but their voices aren't always as loud in the early care system. And we need to advocate for those families. Circle has an advocacy arm. It's called Circle Strong, and we welcome folks from across the community to get involved. And again, check out ctcircle.org to see how you can become involved if you're a member of a community that's committed to the work that we're doing. And, we'll continue this conversation. We are so grateful to have this opportunity to have this platform to lift up these important issues to the community because we know that it doesn't always gets the message and what's happening in a community in early care specifically doesn't always get told. The story doesn't always get told in a manner like this. So hopefully we will have Melissa Griffith in a future call. We're hoping to get some parent voices on the show, and that's the next couple of calls are going to be parent.
You are listening to Inside Voices on WNHHLP 103.5 FM.